In this video we're going to be taking a look at how to play over a chord progression in the style of Brian May and Queen. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I made when I was first learning to play the guitar was thinking that chords were for strumming, scales were merely for playing lead, and the two never ever met. If you're learning scales, you should be able to see the chords appearing in the shapes within that scale. Many famous examples, a lot of people don't realise that a lot of melodies are written with chords. The most famous one being American National Anthem. First handful of notes there are based on an E chord. I remember learning Red Hot Chili Peppers. Now, I was on forever and an age trying to work that out because I was viewing it as individual notes years ago, then realised C chord, then an E chord. Saves a lot of bother and it's almost impossible to forget how to play it. Now, an excellent example is Who Wants to Live Forever, when we actually, the adapted version for guitar. This beautiful cascading melody based on an E minor. Now, on the chart on the screen, I've plotted out the E minor chord throughout the neck. All the black notes, the ones that are coloured in black, are the notes that we're actually using. The ones that are just the circles are the notes that are in the E minor chord but we're not using, and the red crosses are the passing notes that aren't actually in that chord. So if we look at the first three notes, part of the E minor chord, we're going to move up to this 4th fret on the F sharp, which isn't in the chord. We then pass through the open G, B and high E, all part of an E minor chord, to that F sharp on the 2nd fret of the high E, which is a passing note, to the G, which is part of the E minor, E, F, G, to the 3rd, all the way up to a B, which is like your 5th, back to the G. So you got that. So a beautiful cascading array of notes, but all part of a chord with some passing notes in there. Now, if we look at the actual notes that are in the chord, Ian Buxton messaged me the other day wondering what it was I was doing, and I was explaining about, I think it was the Ibanez RG550 video. How do you do that? It's chords, not, I'm not thinking in terms of scales, so I'm using notes that are within that chord. And you've got that nice like a run that nicely comes to an end, finishing on the root note. Check out the caged system and working out chords up and down the neck in all 5 positions, going to help you out no end. It's a really top tip. When we come to something like, another excellent example is something like the guitar solo of I Want to Break Free. Now I can hear you all screaming, it's not a guitar solo, it's a synth solo, it's played by Fred Mandel, but the reason that that sounds so much like a Brian May solo and everybody thought it was Brian May is because of the nailed melody, and it sounds very much the way Brian May would approach it. If we look at the chords, the notes for that, it's following very closely a chord progression, E, A and B. And the way it does it is brilliant. I'm going to change the guitar sound. That's instantly recognisable as the solo from I Want to Break Free. Now, I've put the E chord chart on the screen. Again, all the black circles are the E chord plotted, starting really with the 12th fret. The ones I've coloured in black are the notes that are being used in the solo, and the red notes, with the red crosses rather, are the passing notes. Now if we start off with this, the first two notes there on the 14th fret are part of the E chord, which we should be able to see there. The 11th note, the 11th fret rather, isn't, but the 13th is part of the E chord. So we can see that, part of the E chord. Now that should be quite clear. Now when we go to the next part of the solo, now that we go to that 12th fret, that A note isn't in the chord, but when we move down to the 11th, that is part of the E chord. It's the third, isn't it? So we can see that that's part of that chord. So the chord progression then changes to A, and we're going to play so when it changes to A, we've got this. Now I've put the chart on the screen for the A again. The black notes, the ones coloured in, are the notes that are being used. So we see there is the A chord. We then go to the 12th passing note. That 11th is part of A. It's the A note itself, and then the E note, which is obviously part of the A chord. So you've got that. Then again, we then change to the E chord. So again, following the E chord, passing note. Even that note, when it changes to B, we've got the B chord there, part of B. So that little section for I Want to Break Free really explains how it's following the chord progression. I'll change my sound again. If we look at something like the solo from Crazy Little Thing Called Love, double stop on the 10th fret, really part of the D chord. Now when we get to something like the that isn't as necessarily obvious about the chord progression. It's going to be, the chord in the background is B flat. So when we actually bending that 13th fret up of the B string, we're actually bending up to a D. Now that D is actually part of B flat. If we plot out a B flat chord, there's that D, B, C, D, which is the third. So we're bending that up. We then move to a B flat. So we're using the first and the third notes of the B flat chord, and then even on that F note is B, C, D, E, F, is the 5th of the chord. So the notes in that whole is all part of the B flat chord, which isn't as obvious as you might think unless it's pointed out. We then move to the again over D, that bit over G, over D. You can see how it's, And even when it goes back to B flat, we're back to that. Now we looked at Bohemian Rhapsody before, and I said I was going to look at how that plays over a chord progression. Again, this is another one. When I first learned to play this, I learned it from guitar tab, wasn't even thinking about what scale it was in, let alone what chord progression. So you can get quite good on guitar by just reading guitar tab, but you don't necessarily know exactly what's going on. So the beginning of the guitar solo is played over an E flat chord. So if you look at that E flat there, now the first note is actually the 5th of E flat there, so it's on that 8th fret. It bends the 10th up, and then it goes to the root E flat. Then it goes to that B flat note, because it's, guess what, goes to a B flat chord, so that so you can see how it's following the chord progression, even though it's not as obvious. Even on that B flat on the 11th fret, when you're bending it up to a C, because you're playing over a C minor chord. And even the we're on a C note, playing over C minor. Now this note here, the E flat, is still part of the C minor chord, C, D, E, so it's still the 3rd. If you played a C minor like that, that's part of it. So now bending that note up, that E flat, we're bending that up to an F, because the chord underneath is an F minor. Now when we come to this part, immediately you're not always thinking in terms of that's part of a chord, but when you think about it, it's being played over a B flat. Your first note is a B flat, and you're finishing on a B flat. So even in that way, that's why it sounds so right. Now we're going to move to an E flat here, and we're going to be playing the... So you may be thinking, well, how does that relate to an E flat? If you played an E flat chord, or arpeggio, so that first note is part of the E flat chord. That is, and so is that. Then we're going to run through it again, this time played over B flat. Now that's a B flat that we're ending on there, and then we're going to bend the B flat up, which is being played over a C minor, so we're playing a C note over a C minor, and even the we're playing a C and an E flat, which is part of the C minor chord which we talked about before. If this is getting confusing and I'm talking too much, just rewind it, watch it back, take a look at the notes and the solos that you're learning and see how they relate to the chord they're being played over, and you'll be quite surprised at how it relates. And even on that bend, as he bends that up to an F, it's being played over an F minor. And that's why Brian May's guitar solos are always so brilliantly put together. They fit perfectly over the guitar solo. They have a definite beginning and a definite end. A lot of guitarists can meander around scales and run about, but his guitar solos are instantly recognizable, and it's that ability to play over the guitar solo and craft it so beautifully, and they stand out as being like standalone. You can't play them differently, otherwise you've got to play it as it is, because it's an integral part of the song. So I hope I haven't confused everybody, and I hope that explains how to play over a chord progression.